We have been in the book of 1 Corinthians for the past couple weeks now, and we have been working our way through chapters 8 through 10. And by way of review, in chapter 8, Paul introduced the morally sensitive issue of eating meat that has been sacrificed to an idol. And he pointed out in chapter 8 that some feel no conviction about this and others do. And he also stated that idols are in reality nothing but hollow statues, right? He already talked about this. So in an objective sense, eating meat sacrificed to an idol is not spiritually harmful. However, Paul also clarifies that those who feel freedom to eat meat should respect those who do not feel such freedom. He said that their convictions to abstain are genuine, and our lack of concern for them can lead to offense and spiritual harm. He says you need to be mindful of those things. And then in chapter 9, Paul anticipates an objection here. Namely, what about my rights? What good is liberty if I don't have the ability to enjoy said liberty? Why should my neighbor's weak conscience prevent me from living my life how I want to live and doing the things that I want to do? That ain't fair, that kind of thing. That's the argument he's anticipating in chapter 9, and Paul's answer was that our liberty in Christ was not given to us to indulge ourselves. It was given to us to advance the kingdom of God. And Paul's liberty is what enabled him to be all things to all people. As we saw in the latter portion of the text last time, he says he's become all things to all people. To the weak he becomes weak, to the strong, strong, to the Jew and to the Greek, such and such. He said these things. He said his liberty is what enabled him to do that. And what's more, Paul clarified that the higher you are in God's kingdom, the more you will be called to set aside your liberties to serve Christ. And for Paul, this meant setting aside his right to a salary. He had to work bivocationally. For Christ himself, it meant laying aside everything, and we talked about that in the kenosis passage in Philippians 2. But this is review. We talked about this in more detail over the past 2 weeks. These messages can be found on the website, or I should say they can be found on our YouTube channel under the topical link, but we have a link to that on our website as well, and you can find that right there on our homepage. But this morning, we're going to pick up where Paul left off with this argument, which is in verse 24, not 27. And we're going to follow the argument through to its conclusion and end this section. He left off in verse 23, speaking of his liberty as a tool for ministry rather than a means for self-indulgence. But now he picks up in verse 24 with warnings against self-indulgence. He gives two warnings against self-indulgence. The first is in 9:24 through 10:13, and the second is in 10:14 through verse 22. And then he re-summarizes everything that he's been talking about for the past 3 chapters in the closing of the chapter. So there's two warnings against self-indulgence and then a summary. And we're going to read through the text as we go. I'm not going to read the whole thing in one bold shot. It's nice and neat and simple, so we can just read each section individually at a time. So here's the first warning, okay? The first warning is this: self-indulgence can lead to the loss of your life's investment. Self-indulgence can lead to the loss of your life's investment. This is seen in verses 24 through 10:13. So follow along with me as I read now. I'm going to pick up in 9:24. Some of these verses, particularly in this section, should sound familiar to you. There are verses that we have quoted and that we remember. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They then do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Therefore I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the air, but I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not become disqualified. Does that sound familiar? It's a pretty famous section of text. Chapter 10 picks right up with the same train of thought. We're not changing theme here. In chapter 10, verse 1, it says, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness." Now these things happen as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, "The people sat down to eat and to drink, and stood up to play. Nor let us act immorally, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day. Nor let us try the Lord, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the serpents. Nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed, lest he does not fall. No temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man, and God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it." Again, another verse that we probably memorize, that we know well. What's going on here? Well, I think to start, we should probably look at the word disqualified at the end of verse 27. He said, "I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not become disqualified." What does he mean there? That's kind of ominous, isn't it? Is it talking about disqualified in the sense that I'm going to lose my salvation and not go to heaven and be with Jesus anymore? Or is it talking about something different? Paul is basically, he's not casting it here as a loss of your salvation. He's more casting it as a loss of your life investment. He's illustrating it in chapter 10 as people, investing their whole life in something ministry related or something towards the kingdom, and then losing it all in the end, and all getting wiped out, and them not being able to reap the benefits of it. And probably the best example of this would be to think of all of the examples of people who spent their whole life in ministry and then got hung up in some scandal came out, and all of it just kind of vanished, and they spent their whole life, their whole adult life in it. I used to be a pretty big fan of Calvary Chapel. I used to be a big part of that. They really drew me in early on when I was walking with the Lord. Early on when I was saved, and one of the pastors there was named Bob Coy. If you guys remember him, he was the pastor of the Fort Lauderdale church. And these guys were on the radio every morning, and I used to listen to their sermons. They'd have half-hour shows. He was one of the ones that was on there, and man, he was funny. He was animated. He was one of the more popular ones. He had, I think, the largest church in Florida, and probably one of the biggest churches in the United States. And so, you tended to look at that and see somebody that you saw something firm and strong there. And it came out in 2014 that he had been, having multiple affairs and all kinds of stuff like that. And he went from being the pastor of the biggest church in Florida to being anathema and gone. He was fired immediately. They pulled down all of his work. You can't find anything. All the sermons that he wrote, all that stuff that he preached, all those hours. It strikes you as someone who has spent some hours in the study writing sermons and stuff like that. All of it just gone, vanished. That's what we mean, up in smoke. And of course, we had the Ravi Zacharias example as well in the CMA. All of his books, all of his writings, just gone, just pulled down. His ordination was pulled, his credentials pulled, all of it gone. But Paul uses the example of Israel wandering in the wilderness, heading towards the promised land, their whole, for decades pushing towards it, and then in the end not getting there after all that life investment. And Moses in particular was one of the ones who did not get there. And isn't that interesting? Why? Because somewhere along the way, when he'd finally had enough of these guys who kept trying him and testing his patience over and over again, he said, "See here now, you rebels, will I get this water out of the rock?" And he struck the rock, he didn't. And he basically blew his stack at him one time. And he misrepresented God in the process, and he caused a lot of confusion, and God said, "You're not going to go into the promised land." And one thing, just poof, up in smoke in a lot of ways. It's sobering to think about that lack of self-control can cost you so much in this life. And the more that we go along as representatives of the kingdom of God and as leaders, if you will, people that the world looks up to, the more that we go along like that, the more the little things that we say and do influence them, which is why he's talking about meat sacrificed to idols and what you do influencing people. I remember recently at work, this happened a few weeks ago now, there's an intercom system. Sam knows it well because whenever you're in there at Wegmans and you hear "Attention Departments Code 86," it comes over the intercom. And there's all kinds of stuff that's made over the intercom. Well, somewhere around 9 o'clock, it was right near the time that the service desk was closing, I hear this loud squeal, and it's just going over all the intercom, and it's just everyone in the store is putting their hands over their ears, and what's going on? And one of the phones went crazy. The intercom turned on, one of the phones went crazy, and it was squealing all over the intercom. And we're scrambling around the store trying to find out where it was. Found it at the service desk, pulled the plug, got the noise to stop. And then one of the service desk employees that was up there goes, "That phone was acting up funny today. Maybe that's why the buttons weren't working right and it wasn't working correctly. Maybe that's why that happened." And I remember looking at him and going, "You're just now telling me this?" And that's all I said. I mean, I know I didn't raise my voice, but there must have been enough displeasure on my face. Keep in mind, I had just been running around the store frantically trying to shut this noise off, but there must have been enough displeasure on my face that it made an impression upon him so that he went home. He called me maybe half an hour later at the store from home, apologizing again for how, "I'm sorry I messed things up. I'm so sorry. And by then I had cooled off, And I didn't yell at this guy, but I must have had a look on my face. I don't know. I always thought I had the most warm and friendly looking face of all time, but apparently that isn't the case. But I mean, I was the one that had to apologize. I was like, "Look, this is not your fault. I'm sorry if I look mad. Be at peace," that kind of thing. You'd be surprised how just little stuff that you do affects people, even little things. And when you make a big mistake, how much it can ruin your ministry. You can cash it all in. That's what he means by disqualified. Right. Paul is making the case here that self-indulgence can cause you to basically cash everything in ministry-wise if you're not careful. So just because you can doesn't mean you should. Just because you have liberty doesn't mean it's okay to take it. Just because you're having a bad day doesn't mean you should blow your stack. Just because all things are lawful doesn't mean you should just do whatever you want. Your actions have consequences. And when they do, it can ruin your entire ministry. All right? Now, Paul gives two more specific statements to illuminate this idea. The first is overconfidence / complacency. Basically, we're saying the same thing there. Precedes ruin. Overconfidence or complacency precedes ruin. What does he mean by this? I just gave you some examples of people that went up in smoke in ministry, And when you hear about scandals like that, do you ever think to yourself, what kind of horrible people are these? I would never do something like that. You ever think that way? Who would do that? I would never do something like that. Have you ever read through, Paul uses Israel. Have you ever read through Israel's accountings? You read through the Old Testament, and you watch these guys, and you go, these guys are some real knuckleheads, I would never act that way. If I had been back there, I wouldn't do that like they did. You ever think that way? That's the kind of overconfidence he's talking about. I would never do that. It could never happen to me. I'm different. I'm better. I have a relationship with God that's unassailable, that kind of thing. These are the types of thinking that precede falling hard. He's warning against that. The Pharisees themselves, Jesus was talking about them in Matthew 23, and he said, woe to you. You look back at the prophets and say, if we were back then, we wouldn't have, persecuted the prophets. We wouldn't have done that. And here the whole time they were plotting to kill Jesus, And so The more we think we'd never do something like that, the more we're setting ourselves up for failures. Overconfidence and complacency precedes ruin. And secondly, what do we do to combat that? Rigorous discipline. Rigorous discipline is essential. Understanding that we have weakness at our core, understanding that we are not immune to failure, is what puts us in a mindset to discipline our lives, all right? To incorporate good spiritual disciplines and just basic disciplines into our lives, to use our time well, to incorporate accountability systems into our lives. All of these things are the things that Paul is talking about here when he says he gets mastery over his body and he beats it into subjection, all right? Idle hands are not good. There's lots of examples of this. This isn't a perfect example, but one that catches my interest from time to time is Tim Cook, who is the head of Apple right now. And the reason that he's interesting to me is he's done pretty well as the CEO of Apple since Steve Jobs passed away. I think it was 2011 when Steve Jobs passed away. Tim Cook has been in charge ever since then. And the reason that's remarkable is because Steve Jobs was kind of superhuman, and it was a tough act to follow. It really was. And part of the reason that Tim Cook does so well, though, is because he is just so rigorous and disciplined in every aspect of his life. If you read his schedule, you'll find out that he gets up about 3:45 every morning. And he spends his first few minutes of the day reading his emails. He gets about 700-800 emails a day, and he starts trying to sift through them to see the important stuff so he can get an idea of what he's coming into. And then, while he's got that stuff in his brain, he goes to the gym, and he works out for an hour or two. And then he goes back and gets breakfast, and he's in his office by 7 a.m. And then he's doing meeting after meeting after meeting till lunch, and he takes his lunch in the cafeteria at Apple with the employees, so he can go down and talk with employees and get a feel for the company by eating with them. And then he goes back and does meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting again till about 6 or 7 o'clock at night. And then he goes home and has dinner. And he doesn't really stop until 8 o'clock at night, where he sits down and maybe reads a book for a little bit. Then he goes to sleep, and he starts it all over again. And it's like clockwork. It's pretty disciplined. It's pretty rigorous, you know what I mean? And this is somebody who is not a professed believer. How much more should we as Christians incorporate disciplines into our life so that we are effective with our commission to preach the gospel? These things are important. Rigorous discipline is essential. Now, Paul is making another point here as well, though, regarding self-indulgence. And this is one that we want to talk about a little bit more, and that is that self-indulgence can lead to partnering with the enemy. Not only does self-indulgence cause problems for us spiritually, but it can cause us to partner with the enemy. And it talks in verses 14 through 22 about that, where it says, follow along with me. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to wise men, you judge what I say. Is not the cup of blessing which we bless a sharing in the blood of Christ? Is not the bread which we break a sharing in the body of Christ? Since there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of one bread. Look at the nation of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices sharers in the altar? What do I mean then? That a thing sacrificed to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No. But I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to become sharers in demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Or do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? We are not stronger than he, are we? And we're going to stop there for a minute. Paul has been talking about meat sacrificed to idols all along. But here, he's elaborating on something very specific with that issue, okay? He's talking about eating meat sacrificed to idol in a temple in the midst of a pagan worship ceremony. That's what he's talking about here. Something very specific. This isn't just getting the meat in the marketplace. This is participating in a pagan worship ceremony. And we know that's what he's talking about in part because he alludes to it in chapter 8. If you glance back to chapter 8 real quick and look in verse 10, he says, "For if someone sees you who have knowledge dining in an idol's temple, will not his conscience, if he is weak, be strengthened to eat things sacrificed to idols?" See what he's talking about there? He's talking about not just eating the meat, he's talking about participating in the ceremony. And most scholars agree that's exactly what he's talking about here because of the context and the illustrations that he's using. And the argument that they have who are doing this is that the idol's nothing and the meat is nothing, so what difference does it make if we go and participate in the ceremony? What difference does it make? It's nothing anyway. And Paul here is responding with something that should be obvious, but is not to them for some reason. His response is basically this: yes, the idol's nothing. Yes, the meat is nothing. But when you participate in a ceremony like that, you are actually endorsing idolatry. You are preaching the message of the idolatry. And by the way, that idolatry is a function of Satan and his demons. And what you are doing is you're promoting their message and not God's. You're actually shifting sides. You're partnering with the enemy. And you're actually preaching the false gospel of Satan and his demons and no longer preaching Christ anymore. Make sense? That's what he's saying there. This is a whole different territory. Paul is saying, don't do this ever. You know, regarding eating the meat, we'll talk about that just in summary in a couple minutes. But in this particular case, don't ever do that. Don't ever participate in the ceremony. And for that matter, what are you doing there? Why on earth would you want to participate in a pagan worship ceremony? The answer, the cold hard truth, is that they're not there to preach Christ. They're there to indulge themselves in the carnality of the ceremony. And they're using the liberty of Christ, saying, I can do whatever I want now, so what difference does it make? And they're indulging themselves in the carnal things that are part of those worship ceremonies. They're using their liberty as a license to indulge themselves, and they're not even thinking about preaching Christ, and they're not realizing that they've shifted to actually preaching Satan and his demons in the process. At what point is your actions about your indulgence rather than preaching Christ? This gets a little bit complicated sometimes, if you think about it. We are called to engage our culture, right? We are. We need to be with them. If we isolate ourselves from them, we can't speak into their lives. If we won't ever be around them ever, we can't speak into their lives. But at what point is our actions where we're kind of engaging with them, at what point are they more about us having a good time or indulging ourselves rather than reaching them? These lines are a little bit harder to determine. Paul is drawing a clear line with the Corinthians. He's saying, when you're at a pagan worship ceremony, you have clearly crossed the line. But as we translate to today, you know, there are some obvious things I can give examples of that you shouldn't be doing, but I mean, it gets a little murky sometimes. I can think of a couple of examples. One of them was about a year and a half ago. A group of the kids that I train and work with said they were going to a bar in the area after their shift was over, and I was the one closing the store that night. And they were like, you should come out and see us afterwards, Dan, you know. And I was thinking about it. I was like, I don't know, you know. Is that, what is that? You know, is that a right or wrong thing to do? You know, I want to be part of their lives, but at what point is this about being, is this about having fun? Or is this about actually connecting and reaching people? What do you think? Is it okay to go play a round of pool with your coworkers at a bar and not order any alcohol and then go home? You know, or at that point, is it just about having fun? You know, at what point, where's that line? You know what I'm talking about? That's the kind of stuff you've got to work out here, and you've got to do some business in your own heart, and you've got to find out if it's more about you or it's more about reaching them. This is an example. This is not a perfect example because this kind of gets more into some of the illustration that is coming in the text here. But the reason this isn't a perfect example is because this is not talking about immorality per se. This is just talking about theological practice, and I want to preface it with that. But Holly and I find ourselves at Catholic masses all the time now. Holly is an employee of a Catholic church. Danny goes to a Catholic school. We go to their worship and I've attended masses. I've attended more masses in the past 2 years than I've ever had in my entire life. And it's really no big deal. I want to be part of their lives. I want to integrate with the people that I'm around. I want to be a part of what my son is doing, what my wife is doing. I've gone to these things. Some of the homilies are very good. Some of the homilies are very boring. However, I think if they came to our churches, they would say the same thing. Some of those sermons are kind of dull. Some of them are good. It's just so long as they don't say that about me. You know what I mean? But too long. Got to shorten it up. It's funny because on this side, I'm considered too short. You know, I go 20, 25 minutes sometimes. Too short, you know. But it's all well and good up until they celebrate the Mass. Do you know what I'm talking about? When I talk about celebrating the Mass, Catholics, and again, I'm not saying this I'm just pointing something out that we all know. And as I point this out, I want to be absolutely clear that I love these folks, and we have a lot that we have to appreciate from them because a lot of what we believe has been established by them. Do you believe in the doctrine of the Trinity? Thank the Catholics. They're the ones that helped us have that. You know what I mean? So don't lose that. But they believe in something called transubstantiation, which basically is the priest has the ability to, and God works through the priest, and the body and the blood of the communion elements are transubstantiated, if you will, into the literal body and blood of Christ as you partake them, which is not something we believe, and we think that we disagree with very strongly here. With that being said, I go to Mass and stuff like that, but when it comes time to take the Mass and everyone go up, should I go up and partake of communion with them? You know, for me, I know that wafer means nothing. I know that it doesn't actually transubstantiate. I know all that stuff. However, I don't do the ceremony because I don't want to communicate that doctrine to other people. And they're very good about it. They have a way. Sometimes you can just stay in your seat. Sometimes you have to actually get up and go around with them because you don't want to be that person that's blocking the row, you know. But when you go up, all you have to do is just go boop. And if you do go like that, they don't give you the sacrament. They just bless you and you go right on by. They're totally accommodating about it. That's what I do every time, you know. And so I feel great liberty to be able to be there and to participate and enjoy fellowship with them in every way. But that's the line I draw. I don't partake of the sacrament there because I don't want to preach transubstantiation. Does that make sense? Those are the kind of lines we gotta figure out. And we have to exercise discipline. Because in a lot of cases, it involves, you know, just having some control over yourself, and you've got to have some wisdom in what you're saying to other people. Now, Paul concludes in verse 23 through 11:1 by basically just rehashing everything that he just said. So we're going to go through it quickly, and then we're going to shift into communion. In verse 23, he says, all things are lawful, but all things are not profitable. All things are lawful, but not all things are edifying. What is he saying there? Just because you can doesn't mean you should. We've been saying that for 3 weeks. This is the third week. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. Think about that a lot. Verse 24, let no one seek his own good, but that of his neighbor. Use your liberty to serve other people, not yourself. Your liberty isn't for your self-indulgence. It is for advancing the kingdom of God and serving other people. Eat anything that is sold in the meat market without asking questions for conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. Objectively speaking, idols and the meat sacrificed to them are nothing. They're powerless, and so, you know, you can, from an objective standpoint, eat that meat and it isn't going to hurt you spiritually in any way. Go ahead and dig in. Don't ask where it came from and dig in. Verse 27, if one of the unbelievers invites you and you want to go, eat anything that is set before you without asking questions for conscience sake. But if anyone says to you, this is meat sacrificed to idols, do not eat it for the sake of the one who informed you and for conscience sake. I mean not your own conscience, but the other man's. For why is my freedom judged by another man's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I slandered concerning that for which I give thanks? Basically, don't ask any questions about the meat. But if someone says, hey, this has been sacrificed to an idol, don't eat it. For the sake of confusing people and causing problems, just don't do it. Stay away from it. Once it's announced, once it's public, stay away from it, because your actions have consequences. Whether then you eat or drink, or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense either to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of the many, so that they all may be saved. Same thing as before. Use your liberty to serve other people, not yourself. Let that principle guide you, and you will do the right thing. How do we draw those lines? How do we figure out what we're supposed to do? Use your liberty to serve other people. What action can I take to lead people more towards Jesus than before? And how can I communicate to them that I care about them, God cares about them, and He wants to be part of their He wants them to be part of His kingdom? Take that action and use your liberty towards that end. Be imitators of me, just as I am also of Christ, in 11:1. Paul lived the example. Paul's only living the example that Christ lived. Christ had every liberty in the world, every liberty in the universe, and He laid all of that down to serve us. Paul did likewise, and that's what we are called to do in this world. We're not called to go around and say, it's my right to do this, it's my right to do that, blah, blah, blah. Christians who are following the Lord are laying down their rights for the sake of the gospel.